Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Ryan, and welcome to Psychology from My Kitchen. In today's episode, we are continuing with Unit 3 in AP Psychology, Biological Basis of Behavior. So, in our last episode, we talked about this ongoing battle of nature versus nurture in psychology. Am I the way I am because of my environment? Am I the way I am because of my genetics? And that is a major biological component of psychology. However, we have our own little phrase that everything psychological is simultaneously biological, which one of the biggest biological aspects of psychology, of course, is studying the brain. And so in this next series of videos, we are going to be talking about the components of the brain, what it is made up of, how does it function, what happens when things go wrong. And in order to really understand the organ that is the brain and our entire nervous system, we come all the way down to the cellular level. And so we start with the cells that make up the brain and the nervous system, and then we work our way outwards from there. And so the name of this lesson, of course, is the parts of the neuron. So a neuron or nerve is the specific type of cell that makes up my entire nervous system. When I say nervous system, that of course includes the brain, but it also includes all of these bundled kind of cable fibers that move throughout my entire body, and they are made up of these specific cells known as neurons. Now, many of you are familiar with cells and cell structures, probably from a biology class where you learn about maybe animal cells or plant cells. Perhaps you have looked at blood cells. And so neurons as a cell are going to have some similar characteristics, some similar features, but they also can look vastly different than what you might expect from a cell. And part of that has to go with their function. So we know, of course, that in the human body, we are made up of several different kinds of cells and molecules and, our fibers and all of these kind of good things that we have going on here. So our nerves or neurons are in place for communication. So when we look at the various types of systems within our body, we of course have our digestive system, we have our circulatory system, all those kinds of things that are our muscle system, all of our skin, all that good stuff, that our nervous system is its own system within the body that is entirely put into place for communication. So our body needs to be able to communicate and needs to be able to understand what is going on around it in order to react appropriately. And so this kind of computer system that is within our bodies to make us function boils all the way down to these individual cells known as neurons. Now, neurons actually come in 3 different types, and they are based somewhat on the location of where I would find them, but also based on their function, and that is how we categorize our neurons. We have sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. Our sensory neurons are also sometimes referred to as our afferent neurons, and motor neurons can sometimes be referred to as efferent neurons. So sensory neurons, guess what they are for? They're for sensing. And where would I find sensory neurons? Well, in the places of my body where I sense. Okay, what do I sense? Well, you probably learned about that way long time ago, that you have 5 major senses, that they are seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and feeling. So where am I going to find my sensory neurons? In all of those locations that we just talked about. I have sensory neurons that are going to attach to the back of my eye. I have sensory neurons that you would find on the insides of my ear. I will have sensory neurons that are up at the top of my nose. you're actually very familiar with the sensory neurons that you use for tasting because they're on your tongue. They're not just on your tongue, however. They're also in your cheeks and also sometimes in your throat. And so, oh, pardon me, the dogs are barking. So you actually are more familiar with those kinds of sensory neurons because your taste buds, right, they have sensory neurons directly attached to them. Then we have our sense of touch. And your sense of touch is going to be found, of course, from your skin. And so you will have sensory neurons that are going to be throughout your skin. So it's not just your hands, of course, that can sense touch, but really all of your skin. And so that's also where you're going to find those kinds of sensory neurons. You also have some sensory neurons within your body, especially in like your digestive tract. Think like in your lower abdomen, so that you know that you have feelings of like needing to relieve yourself and things like that. But you don't have a lot of other sensory neurons internally per se. They are mostly going to be assigned to these major sensory components that I have in my body. And I have, several thousand of these sensory neurons that are going to be found attached to my various sensory organs. And then I have motor neurons. And a motor neuron is going to be responsible for movement. So motor neurons are actually going to be found attached to every single muscle fiber that you have in your body. And so, of course, when we hear muscle fiber, we often think about like our biceps or our triceps or maybe our calf muscles. But really, I mean, you have muscular structures all over your body. Your tongue is a muscle, for example. You have muscles in your eyes. So anywhere that you have a muscle fiber, you are going to find these motor neurons. And again, you have several million motor neurons, several million sensory neurons, okay? But then we come to interneurons. And interneurons, I like to refer to as the in-between neurons because I have billions of these interneurons, and they're going to be found in between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. So if we think about our nervous system as kind of this chain of communication, very likely on one end of that chain, you have a sensory neuron that is going to process outside information like my dog barking. It's going to process that information, and now I need to do something about it, like yell at him, Boomer! So in that process of me yelling at my dog, I heard him barking. I reacted to him barking. I had a muscle movement where I spoke to him and I yelled his name. And in between those two things are interneurons. So interneurons are going to process all of that information that I need. It's going to take the entire outside world, make it into something that I can understand, and it's going to tell my body what to do. It's going to give me those muscle movements, that reaction that I need to have. And so it is actually our interneurons that are going to make up the vast majority of our nervous system throughout our body. And it's the type of neuron that makes up our brain. So now this is going to sound kind of strange, but many of you might have heard of various types of open brain surgery, and that patients were fully awake when that open brain surgery took place. And it's like, ugh, what? Why would this person be awake? Wouldn't that be super dangerous? Well, the reason why that they're kept awake is because we want to make sure that we're not potentially damaging an area of the brain that we're not supposed to. But the other thing about your brain is that the brain itself, as an organ, can't feel anything because there's no sensory neurons there. So while you would need to anesthetize the skin on top of your head, you don't feel anything beyond that because there aren't sensory neurons there, that your brain is made up of these interneurons. And so often I get questions about like, well, what about headaches and things like that? Well, headaches are actually a little bit unique. They usually deal with things like blood vessels, and um, a lot of headaches actually deal with like your sinus cavities and your face and that sort of a thing. So it's not that your brain is hurting, it's other part of your body that is feeling those pain signals because of your experience. But it's not the physical brain itself that has that feeling. It's the sensory neurons that would be associated with your pain. So we have these three major types of neurons and where they're going to be located. So now let's look at the actual structure of a neuron. So this is what a whole neuron is going to look like. Okay, this is a single nerve cell. And let's look at their specific features. So like any kind of cell, I'm going to need a nucleus, and my nucleus is likely going to reside inside my cell body. And the cell body of a neuron is known as a soma. And so this round part right here that I'm outlining, that is our soma, or the cell body. And it is responsible for the processing of information. You can see that the nucleus then is inside of it. Then you'll see that there are these branching fibers that come off of the soma, and these are known as dendrites. A dendrite, from the Latin word for tree, which is dender, looks like branches, okay? And dendrites are responsible for receiving messages, okay? They are listening, they are receiving that message. And then my soma is processing that message. It is determining what exactly is going on, right? This is a messaging system. But then I have this long part of my neuron. And the longest part of a neuron is going to be known as the axon. It is the axon. So you can see in the diagram, the axon is in yellow here. You can see it goes inside of another type of fiber, if you will. And that is our axon. And so our axon is going to be either attached to another neuron, which is what the vast majority of them are going to be, or we can actually tell that in this diagram we are looking at a motor neuron because at the end we have a muscle fiber. And so my axon is going to go and either connect with the dendrites of another neuron, or it's going to connect with a muscle fiber. Now, my axon, which is sending or speaking my message, is actually going to be encased in the diagram, they look like little purple sort of blobs, and these are known as myelin sheath. Myelin sheath is actually a fatty tissue. It is a fatty tissue that serves two specific jobs. One is the obvious job. It's insulating the axon. It's protecting the axon. Because the axon is rather fragile, and because I only have one singular axon and I have lots of dendrites, we want to make sure that that axon, which is going to then attach to that branching, that it's attaching to the muscle fiber or it is attaching to the dendrite of another neuron, it needs to be there, because if it's not, then this becomes a neuron that can no longer function. So we have it in this nice fatty tissue to insulate it, to protect it. The other thing about myelin sheath, though, is that it also helps speed up the processing of this message that I'm sending. So remember, as a communication system, it only works if it's going fast, right? We all know how fun lagging and slow internet can be as we're trying to get stuff accomplished. Well, myelin sheath is like the 180th G that we can get in the process of our neurons. And so we need to have that myelin sheath not only to protect my axon, but it's also speeding up that message. It's making it go faster. And interestingly enough, as we age, myelin sheath tends to break down and to deteriorate, which is one of the explanations as to why, as older adults, do tend to be so much slower, particularly with things like reaction time. And so this can be why like driving a car can eventually become very dangerous for a person who is older, in that them seeing something like a deer, for example, running out in front of their car, the process of seeing that deer and sending the message down to my foot to put my foot on the brake, that physically takes longer because of that deterioration of myelin sheath. Now, I also tend to get a lot of questions at this point when it comes to like Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's is a disease that creates plaque like the scummy stuff that happens on your teeth that should be scraped away regularly by your dental hygienist. But the same thing can happen to your neurons, and these plaques can grow on top of my axons. And so it is preventing, again, for that message to be able to send across. And so when people have Alzheimer's disease, or they have dementia, for example, or Alzheimer's dementia, that memory loss, it's not just a memory loss. This person starts to lose their ability to do all of the things that they used to be able to do. It's not just like, I forget people's names, because everybody forgets names. Like, that's a very common thing to forget. A person with Alzheimer's disease, they forget how to button their shirt. They forget how to brush their teeth. Different types of memories that we should be able to hold on to for very long periods of time, that it's these plaques that are growing on top of those axon fibers that is causing this to happen. So I keep mentioning about the fact that we are sending a message, okay? And when we talk about this sending of a message, where it's being received from the dendrite, it's processing in the soma, and it's being sent along on the axon, the message itself in many diagrams of neurons is often depicted utilizing an arrow. And my arrow specifically doesn't have the term listed, but the message itself is known as an action potential. And an action potential is made up of two components. It has an energy source, and it has the message itself that is being sent. And so the energy source that is making all of this messaging occur is actually electricity. That you have electricity flowing throughout your body. So when we talk about neurons, we often use the term firing. We're saying that a neuron fires. And the reason why we use that term is because we're referring to that electrical energy source that's sending my message along. But the message itself is a chemical one, and it is made up of tiny molecules known as neurotransmitters. So in my neuron, where I started with my dendrite, processed in my soma, sent along on my axon, I come to the end of my axon. And at the end of my axon, there's a couple of different names that I might use to describe this particular fiber. And that is known as either the axon terminals, they might be the presynaptic terminals. I feel like there's another one that I've heard before too. I typically refer to these as the axon terminal, but oh, I know what it was. It's terminal buttons. Sometimes they're also called terminal buttons. Regardless, we're talking about the same part of the neuron. And this is where my message is going to end, and it's going to exit out of my neuron. So this is a diagram of kind of a blown up version of what we've got going on here. We had our dendrite right here. Here's our soma. Here's our axon. Notice the action potential, how we mentioned that it is that it's often depicted with that arrow. It's my energy source, and it's also going to be my chemical messenger. And at the very end, we get to these axon terminals, or terminal buttons, or presynaptic terminals, whatever you want to call them. And so in my image here, you can see them depicted in yellow, and they're attaching themselves in this image to the dendrites of a receiving neuron. And this square is showing you that this is a blown up picture of what a single axon terminal is going to look like. And so I like the term terminal because when we leave on like a train or a plane, we are exiting the airport via a terminal, right? And so or maybe even a bus terminal. So it's indicating that something is leaving from that space. And so in my axon terminal, which is shaped like this, I am going to have these sacs, and these sacs are known as vesicles. And within the sac is going to be my neurotransmitters. And my neurotransmitters are these chemical molecules that are the message themselves. All right, it is the thing that is being sent across from neuron to neuron that is telling my body how I feel, what I want to do. It's giving me things like happiness and energy and contentment and hunger, and all these things that I might need to have happen are via these chemical messengers. And so they sit inside a vesicle, okay? When that action potential comes along, the energy source is strong enough to burst open my vesicle to release the neurotransmitters that are inside. As it releases the neurotransmitters that are inside, those transmitters are going to go to a receiving neuron. Now here's an interesting quirk. Neurons don't touch each other. In fact, neurons don't touch anything. They have fluid that surrounds them completely. So even though we talk about how like they attach to one another or like they're sending messages from one to the next and stuff like that, they in fact don't touch. So this space, this very, very small space that is in between our neuron and the axon terminal and the dendrite of the receiving neuron, or the axon terminal and the muscle fiber, there is this small amount of space which is known as the synapse or the synaptic gap. And so these neurotransmitters have been released from their vesicles and they enter into the synapse. And from there, they need to find their very own receptor site on the receiving neuron or on the muscle fiber. And when they do that, they're passing the message along that it has now activated the next neuron in the chain. Now, another interesting thing is that you'll notice that there are only so many receptor sites, and there's way more neurotransmitters than receptor sites for them to go to. That's because when that occurs, these extra neurotransmitters who don't have anywhere to go, well, they can't just hang out in the synapse and there's no receptor site for them to go to. They'll actually get sucked back up into the sending axon terminal, and they will wait for the next action potential to come along to push them out again. And so this process is a process known as reuptake. The process of reuptake becomes really important to us when we start talking about drug usage, because for many drugs, they're going to affect us right here at the synapse, and that the process of reuptake can sometimes be altered. So I'm going to go back to my diagram before. Wait, no, that's not what I wanted. Oh, yes, I did. Just kidding. I'm going back to my diagram before because I also want to mention something else about how neurons are going to work and how this firing process is going to take place. We talk about, like in physics, when we look at potential, right, that neurons are going to have a resting potential where they are waiting for that action potential to come along. And as they're sitting there and waiting, they're looking at a polarized versus depolarized process. And that in order to actually physically send that electrical energy down the neuron, it's a depolarization process that involves positively and negatively charged ions being pumped back and forth through the axon itself. And so it's physically pushing it along the axon. But here's the deal. Neurons can either fire and send a message or not. There's no like sending a little bit of a message or like halfway working. It doesn't work like that. And this is actually a principle that is known as the all or none principle. That either my neurons are firing and they're sending that message along, or they aren't. There is no difference in strength, that it is simply firing or not firing. One of the best analogies to describing this is actually talking about the use of a toilet. So unless you've got some real fancy toilet at home, you probably just have a lever that you push in order to make your toilet flush. And it's either flushing or it's not flushing, right? And I can't like push the lever down really hard and get a stronger flush out of my toilet. I mean, again, if I have a fancy toilet with like a number 1 and a number 2 button, I can get a stronger flush that way. But most toilets don't work like that. It's either all or none, right? And your neurons work the same way. Either they're firing or they're not firing. Similarly, once they fire, they cannot fire again. They have to have what's known as a refractory period. And in their refractory period, they have to be able to recharge themselves. And that until they have recharged themselves, they can't send off another action potential. Now, of course, this entire process is a very, very short amount of time. I mean, to us, we can't even fathom the amount of time that it's taking, but it is taking that time where I do need to recharge my neurons in order for them to be able to successfully send out another action potential. So today, going back here, we have talked about the branching fibers of the dendrites that are receiving my messages. The soma is processing my message. My axon is sending it along its merry way as it is insulated in a fatty tissue known as myelin sheath. That message is an action potential, which has an electrical energy source, and it's made up of chemical messengers known as neurotransmitters. Those neurotransmitters are exiting out of my neuron via the axon terminal. They hop across the synaptic gap to bind themselves in receptor sites on a receiving neuron. So in our next episode, we're going to spend some time talking a little bit more about those neurotransmitters and the different types that my body produces. So until next time, I hope you all have a great day.